Jared, thanks so much for joining me on an N of one. I know you watch the show. I know you're a good friend. And so, it is our nature as sort of population level scientists to want very large ends. But there's a lot we can learn from individual people and individual people like you. You've had such a fascinating and wonderful career. And so I want to just kind of take you through it. So thanks so much for being with me today.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to take you back, way back. Like, I want to talk about like 7, 8-year-old Jared. Like, what did 8-year-old Jared think that he was going to be in the universe?
I probably wanted to study dinosaurs. I mean that. I mean, I always liked science. That was always my thing. That was always my best class. I had one year where I had a terrible teacher who almost threw me off of that route. She was very focused on being organized, and everything had to be clean and neat, and I am not clean and neat. So that almost derailed my path towards science. But it didn't really occur to me until much later that science was even a possible career. But science was always there. It was always the class that I excelled at.
Where do you think that, like, talk to me about that? Like, because I was curious, because my mom was a scientist, because, like, why do you think it resonated so strongly for you?
I have no idea. I'm a first generation university student. Neither of my parents went to college. So I don't really know where it came from. But there's something about science that always appealed to me, and I'll give an anecdote about that. When I was in high school, I had a friend who was very into girls. We were all into girls, but him especially. And he came up with a theory for why men and women were different. It's not the kind of theory that I would talk about in the year 2024. I don't even really remember what it was, but he came up with his own theory. And I was so enthused by the idea of theories that I went home, opened up a Word document, and started cataloging my own theories. And I created like 2, 3 pages of theories. So I think there's something about that way of engaging with the world that has just always appealed to me, that's just kind of natural for me in a way that it may not be for your average teenager.
I mean, the natural question is, do you still have the document?
No. And I'm glad I didn't, because I'm sure I would get canceled. No one wants to hear a 16-year-old's opinion about why men and women are different.
That was going to be my second question was this one of the theories? Did you agree with your friend's theory, or were you like, no, that's a terrible
So
theory?
I call it a theory. I'm not sure
No,
it would
hypothesis.
qualify as a theory. It wasn't even a hypothesis. It was almost more like a model. It was a way of thinking, a way of like, it's like women are like Barbies and men are like GI Joes type thing. Like it was, I don't know, the 16-year-olds, whatever. To
Version
call
of
it
that.
science, yeah, it wasn't really science. It wasn't really a theory. It was its own thing.
But you
But
have,
there
but
was something about that.
you do have a, we'll get to this later, but you do have a particular interest in cognitive models or ways of understanding things, or, that framework oriented view of the world is one that you've carried forward into adulthood. So it's not totally
Absolutely.
shocking that you sort of hear it early on. You
Yeah,
mentioned something
there were
interesting.
signs.
You mentioned
There were
something.
signs from early on.
You mentioned something interesting early. You said, "Hey, I really love science, but didn't see it as a career as an 8-year-old." So when did you start feeling like, hey, maybe this is a thing that I can do? Was that part of your childhood? Like, or was that wasn't really till university that you thought, hey, this.
No, it was when I was trying to decide what to major in for college. So basically, what I did, I went on my computer and looked at my browser history of all of the Wikipedia pages that I had been reading.
Hmm.
And I was like, oh, like I'm reading about this, particular political theory. Guess I read a lot of political science. Oh, and I'm reading about this anthropological theory. Guess I like anthropology. Oh, and I'm reading about Maslow's hierarchy. Guess I'm interested in psychology. And after a while, I was like, oh man, all of this is social science. And it wasn't until I had done that activity and looked at what Wikipedia pages I had been reading that I realized, like, wow, I'm really interested in social science. And that wasn't
which
obvious to me.
which is very ironic, of course, because you're like, yeah, I did a revealed preference experiment to discover my revealed preference was revealed preferences.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I mean, it was kind of shocking because I mean, I liked all of science. I watched, documentaries about black holes, and so I mean, I was into physics, I was into everything. But for whatever reason, it was social science. And then I started thinking, okay, what is it that I'm trying to answer? Like, what is it that I'm really interested in when I'm reading about all of these different social science topics? And it took me probably a couple of weeks of just like really thinking about what it was I was interested in. And I came to the conclusion that I was really interested in why there was this massive gap between who we are and who we want to be.
Hmm.
And most of what I was reading was about motivation. And even the political theory I was interested in was about like, why is it that some people just kind of flounder in life for whatever reason? Why isn't everyone just like, you know, John Galt, libertarian hero, just like going off and creating their own company and doing all this stuff? And I was very curious about that gap. And probably because I have that gap myself, I always struggled with who I want to be is different than who I was. And so trying to figure out how do you actually bridge that gap? How do you organize society? How do you personally develop motivation? Those are the types of questions that really interested me.
And so this is the beginning. Like you said you had to pick a major. Was this like the first year in college you're picking a major? Or
So I did community college actually. I took the cheap route, did a couple years of community college, absolutely hated it. It was boring. The classes were not engaging at all. And then so it was while I was in community college that I kind of did this activity, and then uh, I I meant to study organizational behavior. That was what I wanted to do because I didn't think science was a viable route, and I thought business, but still have that psychology in there. And then my first day of classes, I switched to a psychology major.
when you went off to this is at BYU Hawaii.
Yep, BYU Hawaii.
Yeah, so you got a little bit of experience in the community college range. You then could use that as fodder to sort of say, hey, I'm really bored by this. I'm really spending a lot of time reading on my own. Here's the revealed preference of that reading. And then once you sort of hit, so what might conventionally have been sort of sophomore, junior year of college, you were like, I know this, I got this, and it's psychology.
Yeah, and I never looked back at that point. My first full semester where I did classes, I just loved it. I just absolutely knew that like, wow, this stuff is really awesome. And I knew I wanted to do something with it. And from that point on, it was how do I get paid to do psychology? Because it wasn't clear to me. I knew I didn't want to do clinical. I thought I might do industrial organizational or organizational behavior. But it was just this constant question of like, how do I get paid to do psychology? Because I really like the research. I love statistics. I love the theory. But what do you do with that? There's so many people that get psychology degrees and they never do anything with it.
Yeah, there's two really important threads there that are, I'm also a first generation college kid. And there is a little bit of like, I know what I love, but like because I don't come from a position of abundance, I don't really know what I remember going off to grad school and my parents and trying to explain like entrance into my PhD to my parents, and they were like, we're very confused. Like, they're gonna pay you
Yeah.
to go to school. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not much money. And they're like, but are you working for it? And I'm like, sort of by doing research and teaching, I guess, is sort of the work part. I don't know, but that's also the class part. So I'm not really sure. And I didn't know either, because, if you don't, never done a PhD, and nobody really explains these things very well.
Absolutely not. And I mean, at this point, like, I guess later on, I thought I would probably do a PhD because I still didn't understand that there were other routes besides that.
Yeah. Well, and you also got into research fairly early. I mean, I know you were presenting at conferences and doing publications and sort of, getting into the research phase early in your undergrad. How'd that, was that I know I'm supposed to be doing research and I go find a professor? Was that I had a moment where somebody invited me into a lab? Like, how did that channel factor of sort of like coming into the research part of that? happen, especially since you were so focused on business, on
Yeah.
cognitive behavior?
So there was kind of a couple things. There was so I took this stats class, and it was a applied social statistics class. And there was a kid there. His name is Sue. He's Japanese, and he identified me early on as someone who was very smart. And me and this other girl in the class named Alex, and he decided that we were going to be friends, and that we were going to be the best psychologists and the best statisticians on campus. That was like his goal that he set for us.
Nice. So you
Um,
just got drafted into
yeah,
being.
and we kind of succeeded. He was always the better statistician. But if anyone needed help with stats, they would go to him, and if they couldn't go to him, they would go to me or Alex. And if they had a question about research and psychology, they would come to one of us. And so pretty quickly, we kind of like established ourselves as like just someone you could go to. And we spent probably, I mean, we were in Hawaii. We should have spent a lot more time at the beach, but I spent almost all my time in the library. And I had people constantly asking me questions about various things in psychology because for whatever reason, it just really clicked for me. I just really enjoyed it. And I also pushed myself because we had made this kind of goal that we were going to be the best people on campus for this. But there was also a class that we took that was you could attend these various groups, and there was like a clinical group, and there was a peace studies group, a business group, a institutional research, which is like education group. And so I just started attending these different groups, and there were studies at various stages. So you could propose a study and start going and start doing the study, or there were studies that were already going that you could kind of just join. And so I did everything. I joined every study I could. I started my own studies. Unfortunately, 2 years is not enough time to carry a study all the way through. So I did lots of studies. I think I presented something like 11 different research projects as an undergrad. Um, but I never carried a full research project all the way from start to finish. I did some from, you know, idea formulation and hypothesis, and I did some data collection, but not the ones that I did the hypothesis formation for. And so I did a little bit of everything, but never one study all the way through.
So I have to know, are Sue and Alex also applied behavioral? So like, what did they go off and do?
Yeah, Sue, he's living in Taiwan. He's actually half Japanese, half Taiwanese, and he's living in Taiwan right now. He's looking to do a stats program, so that's still his interest. And then Alex is, she's doing community something or rather. She went to get her master's off in Tennessee, I believe it was.
Got it. So you are the torchbearer for applied behavioral science here of the three of you. We sounds like we still have a chance to suck them back in though. We'll have to reach out to
Yeah,
Sue after the
yeah.
podcast and say, come on, man. You know, Jared was bragging about you. Let's go. So you're in college, you're doing a ton of research, you're about to graduate, you know, and because you have this kind of interesting career, right? Because you had sort of the community college and then college is relatively abbreviated for you, as it was for me, right? I graduated in 3 years because I had credits coming in from APs and things. So you're getting towards your senior year. What does young Jared think is going to happen next?
You know, I don't even know what I was thinking. I mean, I still thought PhD was probably the route I was going to go. But I had taken my interest had always been motivation, right? I had been interested in this gap between who we are and who we could be. And I took a motivational psychology class, and for whatever reason, it just did not satisfy my question. I felt like there was a certain level of analysis of motivation that I wanted, and motivational psychology didn't provide that. Um, and so I knew I wanted to do something with motivation. But then I took a game theory class, or at least it was called game theory. It was more of a judgment and decision making. We read Thinking Fast and Slow in that class, and I loved Thinking Fast and Slow. And it opened up this second question of like, I always thought I knew what I wanted to do. I just needed the motivation to do it. But this opened up the question of rationality, and that maybe I don't even know what I should be doing, and that I needed to kind of take a step back. That there was kind of two gaps: the gap between, you know, my beliefs and values and intentions, and also the gap between my intentions and my actions. And so now I was interested in rationality and motivation. And so when I graduated, that's really what I was kind of looking for, is like, where, what can I do that I can study both of these things, both rationality and motivation?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and often under talked about point. The example I always use is the flu shot. If you look at people who don't get the flu shot, about 50% of them, it's an intention action gap. I meant to get it, but I didn't get it. Like, for whatever
Yep.
reason, there's lots of barriers that we can talk about. And you could argue lack of motivation, I guess, but they intended to get it, at least in their own mind. 50% do not want to get the flu. They're very clear they do not want to get the flu, but they have no intention of getting a flu shot, right? It's not that they've like failed, they had an intention action gap, they didn't even intend.
Yep.
And as a field, we kind of don't even talk about that. We're just like, eh, there's so many things where people intend to do it and don't, that's going to be the bounded domain we're going to sit in. I'm like, no, there's plenty of other people over here who want the outcome that is not getting the flu, but don't want to do the thing that leads to that. So I think you're
It's a harder problem, right? Like, and I think that's why we focus so much on the intention action gap, is all those people who are like, I don't even want to get the shot. It's really hard. And it's traditionally also the domain of marketing anyways. And so it's like, that's what marketing does, but there's no one doing this intention action gap thing. And that's kind of where behavioral scientists have kind of installed ourselves.
I also think it's ethically harder, right? Like
Yes.
ethics of getting somebody to do an action that they profess their intention to do is less ethically fraught than, well, I don't want to get the flu, but I don't really want to get a flu shot. If I then get you to want to get a flu shot, have I manipulated you in some way? Unclear. Like, and that I think it is more fraught, to your point. Like, there's a tendency and a temptation to stay on the very simple side, both programmatically and ethically, without venturing into that morass over there. But it is the nature of science that the morasses are sometimes the place where that's where science needs to go. That's our job.
Yeah. And I think it was while thinking about problems like that that I kind of developed my third interest, which I do have an interest in ethics and metaethics and what's called value theory or axiology, just because there's kind of this third gap. It's like, what should I even value in the first place? Like, not even like what should be my goals, but like, what do I care about in life? And I think that's also a really hard problem. And it's also not something behavioral science can really answer, because what is rational? What's ethical? How can I actually influence your values? Should I try to influence your values? Like, those are really hard questions. But when I reflect on my career, like, those are kind of my three main questions. I started off interested in motivation, and I was like, oh man, what should I be motivated towards? And so I started studying rationality, and I thought, oh man, rationality depends on all these assumptions about what I value. What should I even value? And everything I research, when I'm reading articles in my free time, it always comes back to those three questions in some way or another.
It is part of what makes you such a fascinating person and such a good friend and a fascinating guest. So we got to get back to the story, though. We're in
Yeah.
college. We're grappling with the deep metaphysical things of the world. Like, we're a senior. Maybe we're going to go off and do a PhD program. Did you apply to PhD programs, or
So
to walk me through
yeah,
this? I know
I graduated.
you ended up as a data scientist. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I graduated. The three of us, me, Alex, and Sue, we actually did an internship in Guatemala with Choice Humanitarian. It was down there for 7, 9 weeks, something like that. And when I came back, I started applying for jobs. Um, and my dad had a real estate company, and he was developing this software, and he started asking me questions about statistics, and I'm like, I actually know this. And like, I had taken classes on machine learning, on so I knew how to do neural nets and all this kind of stuff. And so I thought, maybe I can start building models. And so my first job out of college was actually building neural nets and random forests to predict house prices. And that went actually really well. It was a really fun job. I actually really enjoyed data science. I tell people that's a bit like Sudoku. Like, it's the feeling of Sudoku. There's like, you look at it and you're like, wow, that's a lot of numbers. You expect it to be mathy. Sudoku is not mathy at all. It's all about patterns and constraints. And when you figure out what the constraints are, it's this really satisfying, like, yeah, I finally figured it out, and I can just line everything up, and I can just, I can just press play kind of and get it done. And so it was a really satisfying thing. And I built some cool models, mostly with random forest, predicting house prices, what it's going to sell for, how much we could buy it for, what it might rent for. We were using a different data set than Zillow, but we were better than Zillow at predicting house prices, which I was really happy about.
There's such an interesting, so there's an alternative universe out there where Jared keeps going down this line and he's now like the head of data science somewhere. Why don't we live in that universe, right? So you come back from Guatemala, you end up, kind of actually really enjoying this data science, which is understandable. I think your Sudoku point is well made. There's all this evidence that when your brain resolves ambiguity, right, you get a little shot of endorphins because it's like when I see the tiger and that's rewarding, right? Like, then you don't get eaten.
Yep, yep.
So I totally understand that. What happened that made you not end up just going off into being a data scientist?
I'm not a programmer. Like that's really what it comes down to. I could have spent my time just really delving in and learning to program really well. But I had been taught on a program called Statistica, which is just a point and click stats program. And when I graduated and I didn't have access to that anymore, I started picking up R. But even then, I started using a library called H2O that created a point and click interface for me. And I did some programming, but mostly it was my dad, and he was doing it in PHP, which PHP is not meant for statistics, but we kind of had to make it do it. And so I spent a lot of the time just kind of like waiting for someone else to do the programming for me, rather than being like, oh, I'm gonna learn this. I'm gonna get really good at programming, because I just was never interested. I always knew that I wanted to get back into psychology, and I would be perfectly happy to learn R and Python a little bit better. I wish I had spent more time doing that. But my passion was always theory. I was reading every psychology book I could get my hands on.
Got it. And so, there's some world where you end up a data scientist because you learn how to program. There's some world where you end up in a PhD program, but then you end up at Penn's MBDS program. Like, talk me through sort of, so you're doing the data science thing. Is it always kind of in your mind, hey, I'm going to go back to academia here? Or like, talk me through this.
Yeah, because there's not really, or at least I didn't see a pathway where I could use an undergrad in psychology and end up doing psychology. Um, there just wasn't a clear pathway. And so I started looking at programs, and I started looking at PhD programs. I was looking at, U Chicago, and all of these programs that have behavioral science or decision science, if they have anything close to that in the name. I don't think I had a very good understanding of what behavioral science was at the time, or insofar as we defined behavioral science as like coming from the tradition of Richard Thaler and those kind of people. I had been taught that in school, and the explanation was basically you spend all of your time manipulating the subject line on ease. And I thought, wow, that sounds really boring. I don't want to do that.
Right.
And so I didn't really understand what behavioral science was at the time. Um, but I was interested in motivation. I was interested in rationality. And I came across this program called Behavioral and Decision Sciences. And I was like, behavioral science, that sounds like motivation. And decision science, that kind of sounds like rationality. Like, where else am I going to be able to find anywhere that kind of combines these two interests in that way? I also applied to a few PhD programs, but I did it completely ignorantly. No one talked me through the fact that, hey, you need to go talk to the advisor first, or your potential advisor. You need to like go meet with people, and no one taught me any of that. So I just blindly applied to these PhD programs, which is just a waste of money. Don't do that.
Don't do
And
that.
then, yeah,
The only way I got into a PhD is literally Barry Schwartz and Andrew Ward. And I sat down in a room. I still remember it. Sat down in a room in the psychology department, and they just tried to list out people, advisors that they thought would be crazy enough to work with me. They're like, you're very intense. You're kind of insane. We've been in this field a long time. Let's just make a list of people who we think would be willing to sort of be at your level and on your wavelength. Um, And so like Dan Gilbert was on there,
Mm.
like, it was a lot of kind of classic social psychology folks. Um, but absent that list, you're absolutely right. Just blind applying to programs, like, you know, they taught me, hey, you have to reach out to them. And Dan's like, well, I'm not accepting any grad students this year. Great. Well, I don't have to apply to Harvard anymore, right? Like, don't have to do that. So there's like, but nobody, if you don't know, and everybody, this
Yeah,
is why PhD parents have PhD kids because they understand the system, right? If you're not in the system, how would you know any of that?
exactly. Yeah, no one taught me the system. So I ended up getting into MBDS, Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences at UPenn.
Without really having talked to an applied behavioral scientist.
Yeah, I still didn't really understand that this program, like the way I think about it now is that probably the program should be called something like Thaler and Kahneman Sciences, because like that's what the program is in many ways. But like I didn't understand that at the time. I just saw that behavior change, that sounds like motivation, and I knew that there was something about decision making and rationality. I thought this is perfect. These are my two interests.
And if I had asked you going into the master's, you're going to go to this master's and then you're going to get a job, what job did you think was going to happen?
I had no idea. I mean, I really don't know what I was thinking, and if I could go back and talk to myself, I think my decision was pretty irrational, um, because I didn't really know what I was getting into. All I knew was that if I wanted to do psychology, I needed a degree of some kind, um, and maybe this was the pathway to doing a PhD, or maybe I just get more research experience so that I could prove that I could do research. So I don't really know what I was getting into, uh, but it ended up being the right decision. So
Which just goes to show, sometimes our, rational, run them out analysis style version of doing things is not always the right answer. But I love that, this isn't that long ago. This is 2019 when you graduated, right? Which just goes to show you a little bit of how far as a field we still, there are plenty of people out there who would be amazing applied behavioral scientists, but have no idea that Matt and Jared and all of the famous people that, Steph Habif and other people are like have jobs in which they do this thing. We have, we talk a lot to each other. We gotta talk out, which is why we have this podcast. So you're in the program, you come out, and then you end up at Behavioralize, right?
yeah, so basically while I was there, I was looking for jobs, and there was this girl, Dana, who was working at the Behavior Change for Good Institute. And she was doing this data analyst role that she hated, and she's like, "I'm leaving." And I was like, "That's great. I want your job."
That's right. I
And
know data. Great, off we go.
yeah, yeah. So I started working for Behavior Change for Good. They were doing one of the mega studies, Step Up, which is the one they do with the gym.
Yep.
And those studies are there's a lot of data, and it's very dirty data with just lots of issues. And so my job was data cleaning, which is the worst part of data science, by the way. 90% of data science is data cleaning. And here I was doing data cleaning again. But it wasn't I didn't do that role because I wanted to do data cleaning. I did that role because, like, if I can just get my foot in the door at Behavior Change for Good, then maybe I can start, working my way into the field a bit. And I mean, I was there. I don't think Katie Milkman said more than 2 words to me the entire time. Like I was like some lowly person that she just didn't care about. And not no offense to Katie. And
Katie, we love you.
but then someone was out on maternity leave, and in came this guy named Jason Reese filling in for her. And Jason, on his first day there, we were getting lunch, and he asked me about the master's program, and he had never heard of it, and so I was telling him a bit about it. And later he approached me, and he was like, I actually started a consultancy about a year ago, and I'm at the point where I start needing employees, and I'm looking for someone like you, someone who's kind of PhD track but not there yet. And I said, I'm someone like me. Please tell me more. And and then he brought me on part time, and I worked for him for I think 5 months part time before he brought me on full time.
That's awesome. Um, what made you say yes? I think one of the things that happens, I get it, as you know, I talk to tons of young people in the field. And I think people are often hesitant about that first, like, ooh, it's only part-time. Ooh, it's not, doesn't have salary and benefits and all the things that I think a job is supposed to have. And some parent somewhere is yelling at me is the right thing. Talk to me about like making that leap into that somewhat squishy first thing.
Yeah. So part of it was Jason himself. He had been at Harvard Business School and he was at Wharton. He had done his postdoc with Kahneman. So he had a very impressive resume that I was like, wow, this guy is someone who I want to work with. Uh, the other part of it was I knew what the next 5 months of my life was going to look like. I had been dating me and my at the time girlfriend were dating remotely, and I she was planning a vacation to Thailand, and so I graduated, started my part-time job, flew out to Thailand to surprise her and propose to her, moved cross country back to Arizona, got hired full-time at Behavioralize. We got married and moved back across country to Philadelphia with a honeymoon in between. And that all happened in a period of about 5 months. And I knew that I was going to marry this girl and that the next few months were going to be really chaotic. And I thought part-time might be the way to handle this.
Got it. So you saw how this might fit into a larger plan for you. And then that bet paid
Exactly.
off, right? It's a bet. There are odds ratios and things. And then that bet paid off for you. And sometimes that investment can really uh be helpful and useful. And you were there for quite a long time overall, almost 4 years.
Yeah, Behavioralize was a great job. I was Jason's first employee. So that there was a bit of a learning curve. I didn't like, I felt like for the first year, I didn't really feel competent at that job. But I was obviously competent enough that he hired me full time. He was satisfied with my work. Um, but it was a learning curve for him to learn how to handle employee, a learning curve for me to learn how to do behavioral science, because this was my first time really doing applied psychology. And but it was great. Jason is a great mentor. If anyone has the opportunity to work at Behavioralize, I think it's a great company. Um, he does a lot of marketing. He was a marketing professor at both Harvard Business School and Wharton. And I never fell in love with marketing, which
Mhm.
is why I ultimately decided to leave.
As a set of
But
levers to pull or wrong levers or wrong outcome or both.
I was fine with what we were doing. He does a lot of work with pharma, and pharma gets a bad rap, and sometimes it's deserved, and sometimes it doesn't. It's not. I was fine with that, but there was something that just didn't click for me. There was something that was just like I always felt like for every marketing project that I was still relying on Jason to help me structure that project because I didn't really understand how everything related together. But then when we would do a different type of project, so we did like a few UX or tech type projects, and I did those, and it was like, oh,
This
okay,
is it.
I know exactly what needs to happen, and I would just go and do it, and I would get so far along in the project that Jason would be like, whoa, 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 I don't know what's going on anymore. We need to pull back, and I'm like, I'm ready to go forward because like this just makes sense to me in a way the marketing never did.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I often think when we look at applied behavioral science roles, right, there's like a levers and outcome portion of each, right? You know, even if you look at pharma, right, there's a set of levers that are about getting people to take their drugs, but tend to look like messaging and advertising and websites and those sorts of things that are very different than, hey, I'm going to go build, an adherence app that is going to, or I'm going to go work on the system for payments so that people can, apply for prescription assistance and lower those are very different kinds of sets of levers with the same outcome. And then there can be times where same lever is really different outcome, right? You could do marketing that gets people flu shots and you could do marketing that sells people toothpaste. Those are just really different outcomes. And looking at that way can help you sort of, and so you felt good about the outcome, but these levers aren't the levers where I'm really feeling like this is a place where I'm really feeling comfortable about how I lean in and pull them.
Yeah, I always felt like I needed to do a year of marketing. Like I had taken a consumer behavior class, and like that was the extent of my entire marketing career prior to that. And so I was, learning it on the job, and there were certain things about like even the like what is strategy? Like it took me a year before I was like, okay, this is what strategy means when they're like when marketing people talk about strategy, here's what they actually mean. And like here are the different roles that are involved in this. And so part of it was just like I felt like I was always just a little bit, beyond my skis and just not quite ready to deal with marketing. Whereas tech just it just clicked. I don't know. It's because maybe I grew up with you know on technology. I was a nerdy kid who spent way too much time online. Like technology made sense to me in a way that marketing never did, and I liked it. I We did most of our marketing was towards HCPs, towards doctors and nurses, and like that was rewarding. It was fun to try and figure out how do you represent this drug to a doctor in the way that helps them to really understand the benefits. Um, and like that was a fun problem, but the fun was embedded in this larger structure that I didn't feel I fully had a grasp over.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and that, that subject matter, 80% of what makes me a good applied behavioral scientist is that I just have a lot of executive experience, right? Like I've run
Yeah,
companies and, someone sat me down and explained EBITDA to me and, I can do FP&A and like the business skills is a thing that I think is underappreciated. I was having a conversation
yeah.
with somebody the other day who was coming out of academia, and I was like, you really have to get used to, this is a very different game, and you feel really good about the game that you are playing. Like you're very good at hitting home runs, but now we're going to make you play hockey, and some of those skills are transferable, but there's a lot of learning how to skate in there.
Yeah, I feel like many beginning behavioral scientists should spend a couple of years working, just getting experience in the job. Because I've hired multiple people from MBDS, and we've worked with various interns, and I've worked with lots of people who are just beginning in the field. And there is a big difference between someone who has 5 years work experience and then got their degree in behavioral science versus those who went straight from undergrad to master's and are now trying to figure out what does it even mean to do work.
It is
Like
a
I think it's really important to have that work experience.
It's one of the critiques that I hear of the MBDS program sometimes is from those older cohort. They're like, who are kind of taking it more like an executive MBA. They're like, yeah, I know how to be an executive. I like have done lots of work. I'm trying to get this thing that is behavioral science, and being in a class with a kid who's like still struggling with like what does work mean, it can be tough. So that difference
Yeah.
sometimes, that contrast can be. When you were there, did you feel that contrast in your cohort? Were there sort of folks who were more had more work experience than you?
Oh, absolutely. And I was the second cohort. And so, I mean, the program was brand new. I think in the first year they had like 11 students, and my year they had 70. And so there was a lot of growing pains while I was there. And I think a lot of people were pretty frustrated with that. Ended up being exactly what I needed because I needed a degree and I needed a job. And I got those two things and I like wrapped my head around about like what behavioral science is. And so it was exactly what I needed. Um, and I've talked to people, various people who are now in the program, in charge of the program, and they have made a shift to focusing more on those people who do have that work experience because I think they saw that same thing. But going straight out of your undergrad and doing behavioral science is so contextual. And if you haven't actually lived that context a little bit, it's really hard to do that job.
Yeah. So you figure out, I haven't lived marketing. Maybe this is not really for me. Uh, and talk to me about ShadowBox and Nuance and sort of like all of the things that come after this realization that like I need to step away from pulling these marketing levers.
So Jason was friends with Devorah Klein, and Devorah Klein is the daughter of Gary Klein. And Gary Klein is a big name um, in human factors. He founded a field called naturalistic decision making, which is basically the study of expertise. So he started off studying firefighters, trying to understand, um, you know, how is it that sometimes firefighters just have this just like almost magical spidey sense. They're just able to like know what to do, whereas a novice firefighter in that same situation just they don't get it. And so Gary was really interested in like in how the best of the best make decisions. And so Jason was friends with Gary's daughter, and so I reached out to Devorah and said, "Hey, I'm actually kind of thinking about naturalistic decision making as a field I'm interested in because I'd been reading Gary's papers and I was really intrigued by some of the stuff." And she said, "Actually, my dad's company is hiring." And I was like, "Oh man, like if I could work with Gary Klein, that would be amazing." Um, because I think part of the reason I was so interested is behavioral science very traditionally focuses only on thinking errors, on how we go wrong, on biases. And Gary Klein felt like a corrective lens for that. He studies expertise, how the best of the best do what they do.
Oh,
And I had worked on a couple of projects where the thing that behavioral scientists would dismiss as an error was actually like the way that you had to learn, like you had to go through those mistakes. Um, and the, I had used the principles of naturalistic decision making in a few projects in a way that was like, there's something here. There's an intersection with naturalistic decision making behavioral science that was really intriguing. And in fact, Gary Klein wrote a paper with Daniel Kahneman called Conditions for Intuitive Expertise, A Failure to Disagree, which is an adversarial collaboration. I think it's one of the best subtitled papers of all time. And in the paper, they talk about how Kahneman is interested in errors and Gary is interested in expertise, and they agree on the science, but couldn't merge their fields for dispositional reasons. That Kahneman was just really interested in seeing experts fall flat on their face and do stupid things. And Gary was really interested in that, kind of spidey sense, that sixth sense, these amazing feats that people are capable of, and trying to understand what goes into that. And so they couldn't merge their fields. They failed to disagree on the science. They actually disagreed on quite a bit, but they failed to disagree on the science, but couldn't merge their fields. And so I started getting really interested in that. And that's what ultimately led me to ShadowBox. I interviewed there. Um, they didn't have an opening right away, but a couple months later, they reached out and they had a AI project that was coming up. And since I had an AI background and they were impressed with my knowledge of cognitive psychology and NDM and behavioral science, they thought I might be a good person for that job.
that's awesome. And I think your point is well made. When I came up with the like always, never, sometimes, started, stopped, right? That we use inside, right? This notion that for any given behavior, you want to look at all five types of people. It is interesting where the error of omission is by field, right? So some fields are extraordinarily obsessed with the always. Like we're looking at the people who do the thing that we want reliably, and we're like kind of blinded by that, by our active users, and we don't pay any attention to anybody who stopped using it. If you stop using it, you're dead to me, right? Tech has this problem a lot because
Mm-hmm.
often data falls off once someone's left. And so inevitably they're like, well, I'll look at the data set of active users because those are the people that I can sort of contemplate. There are other places where people only, to your point, they only, it's only the people who stop taking the drugs. I've forgotten entirely about the people who continue to take the drug very successfully and go on to a better life. Like I'm only obsessed with those people who are non-adherent, and helping people, using frameworks and programmatic things to sort of address that, is part of the strength of why you're interested in frameworks. I think you've blended those two. Looking at frameworks is a way of blending those two things, right? Neither
Yeah.
being neither being Danny-ish about it, or sort of being purely sort of success only oriented.
A big part of my understanding of what it means to be rational, what it means to be an expert, is that you're able to frame problems in a way that makes the solution transparent. And that's Herbert Simon he made this point in his book that, um, and there was a project I worked on, and the issue was choice overload. And it was this e-commerce product. People come into the product and they're just overwhelmed with all of these options. And it's like, well, what do you do when there's choice overload? Well, the way that we talk about it, the way we even like, what is choice overload? Too many options. That's how people phrase it. Well, and if the problem is too many options, well, then the solution is obvious. You have to reduce the options. And that's terrible. No one wants to reduce the number of options on their product. The consumers don't even want you to do that. They're overwhelmed, but that's not what they want. They still want as many options as possible. And so it was really thinking through like, well, there are people who use this platform who aren't overwhelmed. What's different about them? What do they understand? What do they get? How are they doing this? in a way that they don't feel overwhelmed. And so that really influenced me, and that work was heavily inspired by Gary Klein, by naturalistic decision making, and looking at, well, technically you always have an infinite number of options in front of you. Like, Matt, if you wanted to start singing Little Mermaid right now, you could do it. Like, that is a
Oh,
live
no.
option.
Oh, okay.
Wrong wrong movie.
Wrong Disney movie. That was not my era of Disney movie, man. I'm Aladdin or bust, right? Under
But
the sea.
yeah, there you go.
Oh, there you go. All right.
So I mean, you always have an infinite number of options in front of you, but because you're an expert, because you know what a podcast is supposed to look like, you only consider maybe two options. Most of the time, you're not even considering that. You're not considering what to say next. You kind of just naturally know how the conversation should flow. And so by applying that lens to the choice overload and saying, okay, how is it that some people just kind of know? And it's about this representation, it's about understanding, it's about recognition. And so we kind of embedded that in this product. And yeah, I'm at risk of repeating myself. Like, I- expertise and rationality is really about how you represent a problem. That's what experts are able to do. They're able to represent problems really well. And that's what I kind of wanted to push myself and be outside of my comfort zone. And so that's why I joined ShadowBox. And I really wanted to understand how experts do what they do.
But at the same time that you're starting ShadowBox, you're also founding Nuance, right? And
Yes.
and founding this other thing. Talk to me about the journey to entrepreneurship, the decision to co-found something with the other folks that you're doing with, like at very soon after you're going to ShadowBox. Talk to me about Nuance.
Yeah. So ShadowBox only brought me on part-time because they had a specific project that they had in mind. It's technically an AI alignment project with triage in medicine. Very strange project. But they only brought me on part-time just for this one project. And so I needed to figure out what I was going to do for the other 20 hours of my week. And by the way, like they said this, like, hey, we can only bring you, or like they were going to tell me no. And I was like, I'll work for you part-time. And they're like, oh, we can do that. Um,
Converting no's into yeses, the Jared Peterson story.
yeah, so I convinced them to bring me on part-time, and I started consulting on my own. I created my own LLC, behavior change expert, and started just reaching out to people in the field. I probably reached out to you and saying like, hey, do you have any projects? Do you have any contacts? And I reached out to Sam Salzer, and Sam gave me some advice and whatever. I kept on doing my thing. And maybe a month later, Sam contacted me again and said, there's actually a few people that are all starting to consult on their own right now. And he was kind of at this stage in his career where he wanted to start working with other more experienced behavioral scientists, people who, rather than hiring, someone who's just like fresh to the field, he wanted to work with people who had been doing it for a little while. And so so it's Samuel Salzer, Hassan Alim, Rose Deinhoven, who, she's Dutch and I can't actually pronounce her name. I call her Rose.
Rose. We're just gonna go with Rose. I would not attempt it either. Rose.
Yeah, Rose. And then and Michael Delaney. And so Sam kind of gathered us together and said, hey, like, wouldn't it be great if we could do a co-op? And all of us were like, yeah, that would be awesome because for me, one of the best parts of any job is the people you work with. If you don't work with great people, work sucks. And I really liked this group. They were really great. Michael eventually left, and Aline Hallsworth came in, and so that's the current group. And we worked great together. So we took us a while to come up with the name. It took us months to, kind of working on the branding and the website and all this stuff. But I think in probably October of 2023, we launched Nuance Behavior.
That's awesome. And what a great, I know everybody. I know them all. Because it's not a giant field. And
No.
I do think that is a great model, because behavioral science done well inherently has to be a team sport, right? Like if we take, our individual biases seriously, then the number one way to get through your individual biases is to find other people who have different biases than you so that they can point out yours and you can point out theirs. It's inherently a team sport. Diversity is inherent in our ability to do these things. So I love this model that saw people coming together um, to do. And where have you found your sweet spot as you start to work together? It's been a year and a bit. Um, where have you really found these are the projects that we love and we would take more of these, so that people know what to come to you with?
Um, I mean, we love everything. We try to focus on, the kind of our core offering is, tech, and we really like to do big E behavior change versus little e behavior change. So little e is like getting someone to click a button on the app, it's like in-app behavior, and big E is that real world, what you're actually doing. So we did what we called the behavioral change score, where we evaluated like 7 different exercise apps on how well they do, how well they actually help people to develop exercise habits. And the kind of takeaway from doing that was like apps are incredibly good at that little E behavior change. The E stands for engagement, because of course, like they're UX people and they're able to see what you're doing in the app, and they're very good at structuring that. But when it comes to that real world, like what you're actually doing in real life, it kind of they lack the behavioral science expertise. They don't have enough context. They're not thinking about that real world context enough to really understand what it takes to develop a habit. And so we really like to focus on those big E behavior change problems. Um, I, in particular, am very interested in decision making. So if anytime someone says like, "Hey, we have this decision making problem," consumers aren't thinking about this right, or we don't know why people aren't making this decision, like that's the thing that really draws me in. So I mean, we're varied, we're kind of all over the place. We've got Hassan, who has his PhD in neuroaesthetics, and he's doing stuff with that, and he's got a recycling project. And Sam, he's very focused on habits, and Aline's focused on health. So I mean, we're all over the place. We do a little bit of everything, but big E behavior change, and then me specifically, decision making.
Yeah, it is I dropped a comment on a Rose thing, but I have a longer piece planned for I don't think the problem is teaching companies big E versus little e. The problem is the business model rewards little e. And so
Yeah.
people are performing very rationally in the constraints of the business, which is, hey, little e is what drives our profitability, or at least is presumed to drive our profitability. And so,
Yep.
in a very rational way, I'm going to pursue little e things.
Mapping out the relationship between like what is the metric you actually care about, to all of your KPIs, to the actual observed behaviors that you care about. Companies aren't always very careful about thinking about how all of those things relate to each other. We have what we call the behavioral matrix, where we map that out in more detail, because it really helps you to understand like what is the behavior that you actually care about. And I'm sure you see this a lot, but one of the most common problems when you're working with a company is they don't think about the specific behavior that they want to change. And so there's a lot of time spent just trying to figure out what is that one behavior. And if you can map out that relationship, like how does this, like what are the KPIs that we actually care about, and why do we care about those KPIs, and how do those actually relate to a specific behavior, that often clarifies a problem.
It's almost like someone created a process-driven thing called the behavioral statement to force people to do that in advance of doing the project. So we have to end on this because I'm going to have you back. We got to figure out a format. But one of the things that you personally have taken on and been really interested in is evaluating the frameworks or models or dot 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 of there's some debate about what we should even call them, right? You and I were talking about cognitive frameworks versus process models. Um, you've got this list of, you're ranking them. Tell me a little bit about how did this, it is a natural evolution of your story, right? Like hopefully the last hour has proven why this is a project that makes perfect sense for Jared to want to go to. But what was the genesis? You're like sitting around on a Saturday debating with somebody the relative merits of something. Like how did this become something you wanted to write about?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm always interested in how people frame problems and how that clarifies what the solution should be. So I think it is a very natural evolution of my career that I would focus on frameworks like this. But it really started with Samuel Salzer, he was doing a boot camp, and as part of his Habit Weekly and behavioral design podcast, and he invited me to one of the classes and said, "Hey, let's just rank frameworks." And I was like, "Great." And I jumped on this call. We didn't coordinate at all about what we were going to talk about, other than I knew we were, he had a tier list, S, A, B, C, D tier, and he had a list of frameworks. And I just jumped on the calls and I was like, "All right, let's rank frameworks." And I really thought we would disagree. In fact, I started off the call saying that I was going to intentionally try to play devil's advocate because I thought that the value would be less in the actual ranking than in seeing two people disagree about the strengths and weaknesses of a framework. And we ended up agreeing on basically everything. And I couldn't even figure out how to disagree if I wanted. And that made me really curious about, like, because I've had projects where I try to apply a framework and it just doesn't work. It just, for whatever reason, it's just not clicking. And I change to a different framework and it just does. It just like, oh, and everything snaps into place. And now the problems, everyone just knows what they're doing now. And it's a framework that doesn't work in one context works in another, and vice versa. And I haven't ever really been able to figure that out. There's a mapping that sometimes occurs where it's just a framework just works for this context. And I thought I should try to figure this out, but I don't know what the dimensions are yet.
Mm.
So I'll just do a sort of public sense-making exercise, thinking in public. I'll kind of put my thoughts out there in the world, and I'll be just controversial enough to get some comments so that people can push back and say, "Jared, you're stupid. There's no way you can rank frameworks like this because they work in different contexts, and here are the dimensions that actually matter." Like that would have been the ideal outcome. Like someone came in and told me, like, here are the dimensions that actually matter.
Cognitive models versus process models. Damn it. This is the thing that matters. But it's funny to me that you started from a place of not controversy, because they certainly have been controversial. Every time you post one, it's all out war in the comments. I think one of my first, I'm just going to have to block this person on LinkedIn, was a result of like one of the comment threads on your thing where I'm like, this person is just being snarky and wrong. And so I just am going to have to like cut the cord here. They have been very controversial.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, when me and Samuel had done the live ranking of the frameworks, which was a lot more chill. We didn't really have a clear criteria. A lot of it was just like vibes. We ranked like Lewin's equation really high because of historical importance, not because you would actually necessarily use it, for example. Um, I had identified COM-B and the fog behavior model as the two that would provoke the most controversy. And there was people in the comments like, "Well, what do you mean? Why do you say that?" And I'm like, they just would. Trust me. And I was absolutely right. Those were the two that provoked the most controversy, and it caused a few white hairs on my head the weeks that I was posting about those.
Yeah, it is interesting to me that they're not particularly. What's interesting to me about the controversy in them is that neither of them is particularly good, right? Like neither of them is what, as someone who's relatively obsessed with process models, right, rather than cognitive models. I don't know, pick a cognitive model. I don't care. Like, could be, you want to make it BMAP, you want to make it, COM-B, you want to make it computing pressure. I don't really care. But people will die on that hill. And that, that was the controversial thing to me, was that people were so extreme on it. As someone who doesn't care, like, I'm like, yeah, they're both
Yeah.
fives, right? That people were like, no, it's a 10 and I will kill you if you say otherwise. That's the part that I was like, how can you have such a strong opinion about a thing that is essentially hot swappable, right? With another thing.
Yeah, people, and that's I think one of the things that I was curious about when I was starting the series is like, why do people have such strong opinions about it? Is it that we're working in different domains? Like some frameworks just work better in health, for example, or work better in marketing. Some frameworks are really great if you're designing a single intervention, and others are really great if you're designing an entire strategy. And so I thought, maybe it's that type of stuff. And I was hoping that people could help me clarify in the comments, like what are these dimensions that actually matter when thinking about when to apply a framework? Because it would be really great if I could enter a project and just kind of know, like, oh, for whatever reason, East and COM-B are not the right model for this one, but BMAP, fog behavior model is going to be just perfect for this project. Because I feel like I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do I represent a problem in a way that makes it intuitive and gets everyone on board, that makes it easy to communicate, that everyone's just like, oh, okay, well, once you put it that way, now I understand. I just need to make it easy, or just I need to do this one thing. And if you can get to that stage, projects often flow really easily, but it often takes me a while to get there. And I was hoping that people would clarify it, but instead people have just very strong opinions, like, no, always use this model. And it's like, well, so
And on things that in many ways feel orthogonal to the model. Do I think BJ Fogg is an arrogant asshole and thus I hate his model? Am I from the UK and so I prefer COM-B because it's European derived? Like, do I care whether it was published in an academic peer-reviewed format or not? Right? Came up as an interesting thing that people were loading on, which are very different than the like, when is it useful full sort of characteristics. They're much more about like the circumstances of its development.
yeah.
Um,
I think you called this out in the comments that we were debating personalities, and I think there was definitely an element of that, especially around BJ Fogg. People have strong feelings about BJ Fogg, which I don't think are merited. I think he's a good guy. He's quirky. He doesn't follow the traditional academic pathway, and so sometimes academics are very gatekeeping about that, and they don't like how he does things. Um, but yeah, I think there was this large element of debating personalities to it as well.
well, and to your point, there is a way to debate aspects of the things that come out of personality. Like, hey, one of these is in the public domain, and one of they have different usage licenses. That is a reasonable difference between the two, right? That they
Mm,
have different usage licenses is like a reasonably understandable difference between the two things. That's different than does one work better or not, right? Like your
yeah,
ability to use it is different. Your legal ability to use something is different than how well it works as a tool. Uh,
yeah.
it,
And there,
it's
there was also confusion about it as well. I think some of the criticisms, looking back on it, I, I endorse some criticisms that now I'm like, oh, I think all of those criticisms are wrong, actually. And I really regret my original review of the fog behavior model. I think I got it pretty wrong.
yeah, I hear you. Although I will say one of the characteristics of models is their explainability, right? We find this in AI, we
Yeah,
find this in lots of places. And so if a superficial understanding of the thing leads you to wrong conclusions, that is a weakness of the. I've worked as someone who works very hard on process models. There are a million tiny things that I have tweaked in the side model doing it properly that are really about, man, if you don't know what you're doing, I'm just going to make sure that you don't jump off a cliff here where you shouldn't jump. Like, there are a lot of things that are built in to help people not jump off a cliff. And
yeah,
so I hear you, and I think it is possible to get BMAP wrong, but I think that like it, my experience of BMAP is that it is hard to explain to somebody who's never encountered things before, and that is a feature of
mm,
the model, and explainability is a feature of the model that we need to pay attention to. But we're going to do a second show, and I'm going to get some
yeah.
other people that aren't just you and me, and we're gonna fight this out. We'll fight a bit about process models. We'll fight a little about cognitive models. I'll just turn off my camera and mute myself for the cognitive models because I couldn't care less. But the process model part, I have opinions about. Jared, this is so fun. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. I mean, I think the journey matters. We do see commonalities across stories, but each one of them is so unique, and I really appreciate you passing on your wisdom about jumping into things and taking risks on part-time things and places. This person is a person I want to work with, and so I'll make some sacrifices to be able to work with this person. Congratulations on the success of Nuance and all the wonderful work you're doing there, creating awesome content. And we're going to get you back again. We're going to do a special episode where we just yell about frameworks. Maybe we'll do like a drinking game or something with it. We could see how bizarre I can make this. But we're going to get it to happen. Jared, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you, sir.
No, thanks, Matt. It was great fun.